application of economics. There's a reason Hidden Order is a better book than Price Theory, and it's not just because I wrote it second. The reason is because when I was writing Hidden Order, at some point I realized that if at any point in this book the reader decides he's not interested, I'm losing him. No one is making him read it, unlike a textbook. So if you want to know why textbooks are as bad as they are, think about the incentives of authors. All right? So, in any case, so I should say that when I wrote Hidden Order, what I ended up doing was trying to start every chapter with a hook. Trying to start every chapter with some question, puzzle, set of ideas, such that the reader would want to get to the end of the chapter to find out the answer. That was the tactic I used. And it's been my most successful book, I should say, by a fair margin. And it's not up on the web because I couldn't get my publisher to let me do it. The first, I think I've got a sample, maybe the first chapter or something is on the web. So that one you actually have to buy if you want to read it. But that's fine. I don't mind your buying my books. I don't mind your not buying my books either. I write them mostly to get them read and only secondarily as a source of income. All right, so let me go on to look at the market for legal assent. And at first glance, it looks like a perfectly competitive market, because here there are all these millions of people agreeing. But then if you're an economist, you say, wait a minute. On a competitive market, if I was thinking of buying a bushel of wheat for you and a bushel of wheat from him, and you decide not to sell me any, I buy 2 bushels from him. But if I want to buy your agreement to legal rules, to a set of legal rules with me and his agreement, I don't get to buy 2 agreements from one guy and none from the other. All right? So it's not really a competitive market in which people are producing things that are substitutes for each other. What it really is, if you sort of work out the arithmetic, is about 2 to the 17th bilateral monopolies. All right? No, 10 to the 17th, I'm sorry. 10 to the 17th bilateral. We've got a population of 300 million people. For the mathematically inclined, that's 3 times 10 to the 8th. Every pair of people represent a bilateral monopoly in agreeing on the legal rules between them. So you square that number, and you have a very, very, very large number of bilateral monopolies. And therefore, the standard economic analysis of perfect competition isn't going to work. And you have to think rather in terms of the analysis of bargaining in bilateral monopoly. Bilateral monopoly for the non-economists means one buyer and one seller. And in what I am describing, that's the case, but it's the case for every pair of people. Only you can agree through middlemen to rules with me, only I can agree with you. But even in bilateral monopoly, rational people are going to tend to bargain to efficient outcomes, because if I value the rule more than you do, then I'll be willing to make you an offer you'll be willing to accept. So again, for the economists in the audience, the argument for efficiency here owes more to Coase than to Marshall. Alfred Marshall is the man who put together modern economics a little over 100 years ago. Coase is a much more recent author, and Coase made the point that where there are inefficient arrangements, in principle it's always in the interest of the parties to bargain them away, because that means there's some gain to make from that. At a slight digression, going back to market failure for a moment, I like to say that another name for market failure is a profit opportunity. Because market failure means that people are acting in a way such that if they acted differently, they'd all be better off. So if you're sufficiently ingenious to think up a way of getting them to act differently, with any luck you can pocket some noticeable fraction of the amount better off they are, and then you make yourself rich and you make the world a better place all at the same time. This reminds me, by the way, of one of my favorite quotes. There was a Texas oil millionaire, whose name I'm now blocking on, but it'll come to me in a minute, who was a right-winger, and he had a chain of radio stations. And the radio stations, among other things, put on programs arguing for his political views. And he was interviewed by Playboy magazine. And Playboy magazine, the interviewer, took it for granted that he was subsidizing these radio stations to spread his views. And he said, oh, no, they make money. If this country is worth saving, it's worth saving at a profit. Which I always thought was a wonderful line. Anyway, so the nature of the market then is not a standard economist competitive market, but it is a market which has got a dynamic that ought to drive you towards efficiency because the parties who are doing this bargaining via their middlemen care. And again, for the economists in the audience, if you go back to my analysis of the two agencies bargaining, I hope some of you realized that it's not a perfectly efficient process because the agencies only care about marginal customers. That if I'm somebody who really likes the agency, the fact they make it like it even more isn't going to give them anything because what determines the price they can charge is the price at which the people who aren't sure they like it would leave. All right? In the same sense, Apple Computer could raise the price of their computers by 10%, I'd still buy them. What constrains Apple are the people who are foolish enough to switch to Windows if only the Apple gets a little more expensive. All right? So again, this is probably enough. If there are economists in the audience, they can think through for themselves the logic of this system. I just wanted to point out that it was, in fact, a more complicated and interesting system than I had originally thought. Let me now go on to the third section of my argument, and this is where Jim Buchanan comes in. Because Jim pointed out in his review that when I described the two agencies bargaining, I never said which one had to pay the other. All right? So imagine our agencies are bargaining over capital punishment. And the agencies both agree that it is worth more to the anti-capital punishment agency than the pro-capital. Does that mean that the anti-capital punishment agency has to pay the pro to agree? Or does it mean that all it has to do is to turn down the offer that the pro made it to agree the other way? Or putting it differently, is the default, is the starting point they are bargaining from a legal rule with or without capital punishment? So that was Jim's original point, and he was right, that I hadn't thought about the question. For economists, this is really the old division between allocation and distribution, that the allocation is getting efficient rules. The distribution is figuring out which set of customers have to pay for them. All right? It's just like imagining an ordinary free market society and saying, we've proved it'll give efficient outcomes, but according to whom we assume starts out owning stuff, we might get very different efficient outcomes. If you imagine a society with slavery, which starts out with some people owning other people, legally speaking, standard economic arguments go through, you get an efficient outcome, but it's not a very good efficient outcome for the slaves. You would get a different but still efficient outcome in the economic sense if you didn't have slavery. All right? Similarly for who owns the land, for all sorts of other issues. Well, in this case, in a certain sense, Jim is asking who owns the right to have what legal rules? Where do we start? And I thought that was a very interesting question and one that got me thinking. And I guess my answer was that underlying this bargaining game, there's an implicit threat game. That underlying the bargaining game, there is the knowledge by everybody that if we don't reach agreement, we start shooting each other. And that therefore somehow where we end up reaching agreement reflects where we think we would end up if we had to fight. Right? And in fact, thinking about that, I suspect that all societies have an implicit threat game underlying their bargaining games. That if you think about things like the Occupy Wall Street movement, one way of reading that movement is people saying, we are not willing to play by the rules. We're not willing to accept your legal rules. We think we're getting too bad a deal, and we are therefore going to use force, very modest kind of force, just sort of going places we're not allowed to go. They don't have any guns as far as I know. But nonetheless, we are willing to break the rules in order to try to insist on getting what we want. And if you think about something like the current chaos in Syria, that's a much more extreme version of the same thing. So I think people talk about a social contract. And the idea of a social contract is normally said it doesn't make a lot of sense. If people say, why are you obliged to obey the law? Well, you agreed to. When did I agree to that? Well, you stayed in the country. Well, but in order for my staying in the country to agreement, the government has to already own the country. It's got to already have the right to say, if you don't agree to our rules, you have to leave. But they're supposed to own the country because of the social contract. So the argument becomes entirely circular. But I think there is a different sense in which it makes sense to think of an imaginary social contract. But it's not really a contract, it's a peace treaty. That is to say, you have a society. I know perfectly well that I can't get everything I think I'm entitled to, because we disagree. You know you can't get everything you think you're entitled to. We also know that if we start shooting each other, someone's going to get hurt. And so people end up saying, well, this is how much of what I think I'm entitled to I'm willing to put up with getting and how much with not getting, so are you. And within some range, none of us are going to start using violence to upset the society as long as that happens. Now, I don't think that solves the question of why are you obliged to obey laws, but then I don't think you are obliged to obey laws, so that's not a problem for me. I think you're obliged not to do wicked things. You're obliged to obey the law against murder, but you would still be obliged if there were no law against murder. But I think you're not in general. I don't think that right and wrong are made by act of Congress. Why? Because peace treaties are not morally binding. There is this rule in the law that a contract made under duress is not a legitimate contract. And it's hard to think about more duress than dropping bombs on people, which is what usually precedes peace treaties. So anyway, so much on sort of general views on how societies work. But let me go back to the more interesting question to me of what are the implications of this analysis for the working of my system. Because one of the questions I haven't yet mentioned, but that I discuss in the book, is the question of whether my system is unstable due to agencies getting together, deciding that robbery is more profitable than production, and reinventing government. All right? You could certainly imagine in my system that the rights enforcement agencies, they're talking to each other all the time, they're negotiating agreements. How about negotiating an agreement which says none of our customers are allowed to quit? I won't take your customers, you won't take my customers, and by the way, we're raising our rates. All right? They've just reinvented government. They've created a cartel, from the economists in the room, which cartel in effect is a government. Question is, how likely is that to happen? Now, there are a number of things that might prevent that. If you imagine a society where lots of people have guns and are willing to use them, then the right of revolt might prevent that. But I suspect that at a more realistic level, the real question is how many agencies there are. Because if you think about cartels in general, in an industry with 2 or 3 firms, cartels are likely to be practical. In an industry with 100 firms, cartels don't work, because as soon as a few firms get together and start raising their prices, everybody else says, wonderful, prices are high, let's produce all we can. And that drives prices back down again. Similarly here, I think that it would be very hard to make that cartel work if you end up with 100 or 1,000 rights enforcement agencies. Because when a few firms start getting together, that gives other firms an incentive to say, we'll be delighted to take your customers, all of them, thank you, and we will defend your customers from you. But if you end up with 2 agencies or 3 agencies, you might well be in trouble, because then it becomes practical for them to convert my anarchist system back into a government with them running it. And that might even be worse than our present government. Who knows? When I wrote Machinery, I was thinking of the size of firms in terms of the economics of enforcing rights. All right? I said, is there reason to believe that a big rights enforcement agency with lots of customers could produce better service at a lower cost than a small one with few? And I said, I don't think so. That if you look at least at the government equivalent, we don't observe that big city police departments manage to prevent crime better, cheaper than small town police departments. I can't see much evidence. It's hard to be sure, but it's a service industry. Most service industries don't have huge economies of scale. So my guess at the time was that it would be 100, not 3. Right? That's fine. But I've now complicated the analysis by observing that the agencies are really producing 2 different products. One of the products is rights enforcement. The other is threatening other agencies in order to get a good deal. Well, in many circumstances, if you think of international history, in many circumstances there are quite large economies of scale to the use of violence. Not always true. All right? There have been times when big countries couldn't beat small countries. And, of course, small countries can ally with each other. So it depends partly on the technology of several small agencies getting together and agreeing if the big agency tries to bully us, we'll all work together. But there is at least the concern that it might turn out that even if economies of scale were not very large in protecting rights, that economies of scale were quite large in threatening other agencies in order to make sure that they paid you when they wanted a rule rather than you're paying them when you wanted one, in which case my system could break down, in which case you could end up with too small a firm. So that's, from my standpoint, the intellectually interesting part of this story, which is that Jim pointed out a problem which had, on the face of it, nothing to do with economies of scale. It was just that there was a step in my argument I'd missed. I filled it in. When I fill it in, I discover that it indeed, to some degree, undercuts a different and apparently unrelated part of the argument about economies of scale. How serious is this? I don't know. My guess is that if the system is once established and working, it's not going to be much of a problem. Because I think if you look again at the international situation, you observe that there is an enormous inertia to the equilibrium of these threat games. We don't observe that every time a country launches another battleship, its border moves 3 miles out. You don't observe that if a country cuts its military budget, its border moves 5 miles in. So it looks, in this case, and I think a lot of others, as though this kind of a threat bargaining game, once you've got a status quo, you tend to stick with the status quo. That in the world I'm describing, once everybody knows what the rules are, now if my company tries to change them in its favor and says, and I'll fight you if you don't, everybody else will say, that's crazy. What do you want us to do? To be killing each other? Don't be absurd. We will all oppose you and it won't work. Okay? So my guess is that once established, it's not too serious a problem. And you're back to the case where 98% of what the firms are producing is rights enforcement, and only 2% is the tanks in the basement, just in case. I mean the kind of tanks that go bang, bang, not the kind of tanks you put oil in. And if I'm right, then hopefully we'll get reasonably small firms, a competitive situation, and it works. But I could be wrong. I certainly don't want to claim in any sense that I know for certain how this system will work, only that I think I can make a plausible case for the claim that it would work better than the kind of systems that we now have. All right, there are some other things that will be in the third edition when and if I write it. I have some problems associated with copyright law due to the fact that my publisher of the second edition controls the copyright unless they let the second edition go out of print. I haven't yet gotten them to agree to do a third edition or to return the copyright to me, and it is quite unclear whether or not they let the second edition go out of print, because our concepts of out of print existed before print-on-demand publishing existed. And the question is, if they say, as they did for several years, if you like a copy, if you want a copy of this book, tell us, and in 2 months we'll print one for you. Is that in print or not? Don't know. So in the worst case, what I will do is to write all the additional stuff for the third edition and put it up on my web page, and I've already got the second edition up on my web page because I did talk my publisher into doing that. I should say the copy of the second edition, a PDF on my web page, is a pirate copy. I discovered, not by me, I discovered online that somebody had pirated the book, that somebody had scanned it in and put up a PDF of the book. And I told my publisher. And they did something and it disappeared. And after a while it appeared again. And I said to myself, they aren't hiring me to be their enforcement arm. If they want to prevent people from pirating the book, let them pay attention. But I did download a copy for myself. I then eventually persuaded my publishers, since they weren't selling very many copies, it's an old book, to give me permission to put a PDF up on my webpage, and guess where I got a PDF to put up on my webpage. So I have pirated my pirate, which seemed to me entirely appropriate. Anyway, so let me say a little bit about the other stuff that will be in that third edition when and if I write it. And one of them is an expansion of something that's already in the book, and that is really the question of, have I really proposed an anarchy without government or a different kind of government? Are these rights enforcement agencies really governments? And that turns out to be quite an interesting question, because it gets you thinking about why do we call some things governments and not other things. I don't think there is anything that a government does that has not at some time and place been done by things that aren't governments. All right? For example, we tend to think of warfare as a government activity. As best I can tell, the Norse armies that ravaged Anglo-Saxon England were mostly entrepreneurial projects. They weren't national armies. You had some leader with a good reputation, and he got a whole bunch of Vikings to come and said, look, we can get loot, we might even get some land, let's go visit England. And I think the same thing is true through a wide variety of other government activities. So why do we call some things governments and some not? And the answer I came up with in Machinery of Freedom, which I think was the right answer, except I think I understand it better now than I did then, is that government is what I refer to as an agency of legitimized coercion. And I tried to explain that I was using both words in special senses, because I didn't know of any words that really said what I meant. Because I wasn't using coercion as a moral category. What I meant by coercion was the sort of act which, if other people did it to you, you would violently object to. You might be right or wrong. All right, I'm not a moral philosopher. As I've said somewhere else, I prefer not to base my arguments on moral philosophy, because moral philosophy is a project that hasn't gotten very far in the last few thousand years. I prefer to base it on economics, to basically argue most people have about the same objectives of what they would like a world to be like, not in detail, but roughly. If I can persuade you that the institutions I want will better achieve your objectives, I don't have to make arguments about what objectives you ought to have. That's been my tactic for 40 years or so. So in any case, but we know that people do regard things as coercion, that when someone steals stuff from you, you yell, you run after him, you hit him in the head, you do what you can, and you do that even if you know that the value of what's been stolen is not large enough to make it worth all this effort to respond. All right? We observe that human beings have what I think of as built-in commitment strategies, which basically say if you cross certain lines, I will bear large costs, not infinite costs, but large costs to punish you for doing it. And I think I've got an article on my webpage and linked to my blog called A Positive Account of Property Rights. It's not really about property rights. It's got that title because it was written for a conference on property rights. It's really about rights. And the argument I'm making is that you can think of rights not as either a moral or a legal category, but as a behavioral category. That essentially, in all societies, people have lines they've drawn in their heads, and most of them recognize the lines other people have drawn in their heads, saying, you cross this line, and I'm willing to bear large costs to stop you. All right? And that's what that article is about. And I'm arguing that's the real nature of rights as a behavioral pattern. And then what I mean when I say a government is an agency of legitimized coercion is that you don't respond that way when the government violates your rights. That governments, the way I put it, I think, in machinery, is that when the IRS tells you that they have frozen your bank account, you don't go you're running down the street yelling, "Stop thief." All right? You don't do the equivalent of that. When you receive a notice in the mail saying that you're due for jury duty, even though you never agreed to be at a certain time and effort, you don't react the way you would be if somebody came up to you, pointed a gun at you, and said, you're now working for me on the following terms, like it or not. Which is, after all, what jury duty is. It's the one draft that we still have, having eliminated, fortunately, the military draft. So, turns out it's easy to get out of, I should say. It's not a very effective draft. But in theory, at least, that's what it is. So I think it makes sense to think of a government in those terms, that what's special about government is that for whatever reasons, it is an organization that does the things that when done by ordinary individuals we would forcibly react against, and we don't forcibly react against it. Now, legitimized isn't a very good term, because one reason might be you think it's legitimate. It might be you say, yes, government's entitled to do those things. Another reason you might be where you say, well, look, they got an awful lot more guns than I do. It isn't worth trying to fight them. In effect, I've surrendered, not conceded that they're right. So there could be a variety of reasons why we don't respond to government violations of our rights the way we respond to ordinary violations. But I think the fact that we don't comes as close as I can to defining government. And if so, my agencies are not governments. My agencies claim no rights that an ordinary individual doesn't have. They may actually violate rights in a moral sense. It may be that their court's wrong and that their court says you can be punished for something you shouldn't be punished for. But that's just like the fact that a private individual might think he's entitled to do something that, if we only had moral philosophy worked out right, we would know he wasn't entitled to do. It's not anything special about the agencies. So that's one of the things which I think I saw intuitively when I wrote the book, but I see a good deal more clearly now. And as I say, I've got an article you can read which goes into it in detail. The other thing, which isn't really about the market for law, which was what I think I offered as a title for this, but maybe I didn't, at least I've been assuming I did, is what I referred to as the hard problem when I wrote Machinery, which is national defense. All right, the sort of traditionally for people who were very pro-free market, the three fundamental government functions were police, courts, and national defense. I've just eliminated two of them. And the question is, what about the third? And the third is actually a much harder problem, because national defense is what economists call a public good. And again, just as with market failure, public good doesn't mean a good produced by the public. The government produces lots and lots of private goods, mail delivery, schooling, for example, and many public goods are privately produced. For example, this speech. Why do I think it's a public good? Because I would like to believe that I will change the minds of some people in the audience, give them interesting ideas, and the result will be a better society 50 years from now. I may be wrong. Maybe I'm optimistic about this. But if I'm right, then I am producing a benefit that I can't pocket. All right? A public good is a good such that the producer can't control who gets it. Well, in principle, the people who set up this talk could control which of you came into the room. So in that sense, it's not clear it's a public good. But there's no way of controlling which people 50 years from now benefit from the fact that because all of you are now enlightened, you go out and you vote against governments doing things and support private rights enforcement agencies and do all sorts of wonderful things like that, with the result that in 50 years we have a much better society. No way that I can charge the people living in that society for the benefit I'm producing. So I'm producing a public good, I hope. I think I'm producing a public good. And there are lots of I could give other examples of public goods privately produced. But public goods are harder to produce privately than private goods because the standard mechanism on the market for producing a good is to say, all right, if it's worth something to you, pay me if you want to get it. And then if what the good is worth to people is more than it costs me to produce it, I can make money producing it. So the basic logic of why a market economy tends to do the right things is that if something is worth more than it costs, you can make money doing it. If it's worth less, you'll lose money, so you won't do it. All right? That doesn't work for public goods. National defense is a public good. If I defend the border against the invaders from Canada, that will benefit you people. You're closer than California to them than I am, since I live in California. So if you defend the border against the invaders from Canada, I will free ride on your virtuous and patriotic efforts. All right? So that's a public good problem, and the question is, how would you pay for that? And as with other public goods, the answer is there are a variety of kludges, a variety of imperfect ways you might do it. And my current view, which may well be wrong, but which interests me, sort of combines a bunch of different things and ideas. One of them is the open source movement in software, which involves a lot of people cooperating for benefits in sort of status and reputation outside of a normal market economy of money. Another thing is the observation of a lot of people like playing at soldiers for fun. The version of that I know best is the Society for Creative Anachronism. I used to participate in battles with 1,000 people or so on a side using swords and shields. The swords were not made of steel, fortunately. We used real armor and fake weapons so you don't get really killed. But it was lots of fun. And a much larger number of people engage in paintball along similar lines. And then the last element in this is a short story by Rudyard Kipling, who is somebody I'm very fond of. And the story is called The Army of a Dream. And in the story, Kipling has come back to England. You don't know where he's been. And it's changed. And he's talking with a young military officer who is a friend of his, who is explaining how things are now. And how things are now is that war games have replaced football and cricket as the national sport. And war games, you're not really using live ammunition and killing people, but you're maneuvering people around with referees who will say, if this was a real battle, you would have won, or you would have won. And the result is that in this imaginary England, you have, in effect, an enormous potential army without depending on actually hiring soldiers. and therefore everybody else is careful not to attack England. That's the bottom line. And at the very end of the story, Kipling notices that the friend he's talking to has a bullet hole in the middle of his forehead and remembers that he died in the Boer War and realizes this was all a dream and wakes up. But it's quite a neat story. So in my oh yes, the one other thing that inspires it is the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, or more precisely, what I believe to have been the motivation for the Second Amendment. That's the right to bear arms amendment. Because I think that in the 18th century,